everyone. I'm Alyssa DeFilippo, Program Manager of Connections California at Parents Helping Parents, and you are at Have You Heard About the Alternate Pathway to Diploma? This evening, we have Stephanie Coleman with us, who has 17 plus years experience as an education specialist and as the coordinator of inclusive practices and integrated systems at the Sacramento County Office of Education. Stephanie champions instructional strategies, fostering inclusivity, belonging, and academic success for all. Also supporting us this evening is Chara Perry, who has had a long career in education and is currently the Assistant Director of the California Collaborative for Inclusive Practices. And the vision of the California Collaborative for Inclusive Practices is that every student in California, including students with disabilities, thrive socially, emotionally, and academically within inclusive learning environments. We thank Beatrice, our Spanish interpreter, for supporting this evening, and Kristen Wright will also be in the background answering some questions and manning the chat, womaning the chat, personing the chat. Okay, I am going to hand it over to Stephanie now. Thank you all for coming. And there we go.
All right, I will see if I can get my share to work this time. Hi, everyone. That was such a nice introduction. And Alyssa, I can tell you and I both watch a lot of PBS because that's your slogan was like perfectly PBS, right? Okay, so can we all see my chat? Are we able to see my screen? Is it working? Yes. Okay, great. Fantastic. I just want to double check. All right. So I am really excited to be here as part of a partnership between Parents Helping Parents, the California Collaborative on Inclusive Pathways, and California Includes. It's great to have collaborations between multiple agencies, and I love that we get to share this information with you tonight. My contact information will be shared with you as well as these slides. So feel free to reach out if you have additional questions after tonight. We are going to do some Q&A that will be available for you. So we'll answer as many questions live as we can tonight. If it turns out that there's more questions than we can answer, we can share sort of a quick Q&A with Alyssa, and she can help send that out to participants as well. But we'll do our best to answer your questions. If you need to contact me, my contact information is there. So we want to start with kind of grounding ourselves in the reality of why is this alternative pathway to a high school diploma so important? And we're going to start grounding you with this wonderful graduate that you see on your screen, Shelby. Shelby is Kristen Wright's daughter, and Shelby went through a fully inclusive opportunity in high school. She was with her same age peers, and had she graduated in today, right? Like had she been in school right now, she would have had the opportunity to earn a high school diploma because she took all of the coursework that her peers took. And unfortunately, this wasn't available during that time. And so at the end of her educational experience, she earned a certificate of completion. And Shelby has a very diverse opportunity of things that she does. She has a lot of self-determination, and she enjoys fabulous things out in the community, and she's working on a micro business. There's lots of things that she's able to do, but something she's not able to do is mark that box when she wants to apply for work that says, I have a high school diploma. And while that isn't necessarily something that's going to stop her from all of her dreams, it's a barrier that we don't need to have in place. And so as we're talking through tonight, our hope is that we center on the opportunities that this provides for all students, and realize that it expands opportunities. It doesn't take anything away. It just provides more opportunity. I'm going to try and really remember that we have interpretation, and I'm not going to try and talk so fast. So thank you for our interpreter. Sorry for talking so quickly. All right. You're going to also be seeing in the chat, and they may already be in there, some of the resources for today, including this slide deck. The slide deck has links to a numerous amount of resources that are available to you. I will be showing you what this family guide looks like briefly in a few minutes. And then we also have a quick reference guide that you're going to see. And these two resources are powerful resources in understanding this in its entirety, but also in an easy to understand way. So after tonight, if you want to come back and think about it some more and you had some questions, they will be helpful. Additionally, if you have friends and you want to share them with them, that's what we're hoping that you will do, that you will expand people's understanding, whether it's if you're a parent and it is the school that your child is attending, you want to share with them, feel free to. Or if you are a school employee, because we have a number of those in the audience tonight, thank you for coming. Share these with your school, your families, and also your peers in your school system to help them better understand. So those resources, all yours. If you have questions about them or need more access, let me know. I would love to know who's in the room, and I think this might get a little tricky, but I think we can use the chat. So let's use the chat tonight. And if you can just let me know, in what role are you coming and attending tonight? Are you a parent? Are you a parent and an educator? Are you a teacher? Are you a service provider? Are you a community resource provider? Let's see who's in the audience, and we'll just kind of get a sense of who's here tonight. Fantastic. Lots of parents. We've got some ed specialists in the house. Thank you for the hard work that you do to serve students every day. We've got some parent educators. That's great too. Oh, this is looking great. You know, we have a great audience tonight. So keep putting them in there. I'm going to keep an eye on those. Tonight's presentation is going to be aimed more to a simplicity of understanding it from an overall perspective, but really aimed towards helping families understand it. So as I talk about things, educators that are in the room, this is all applicable to you 100%, but I'm not going to use as much teacher and educator speak because that doesn't help anybody. So just know that there is more to the system-wide information that I'm happy to share with anyone who is in the education system and needs a little support, but it's the expanded version of this presentation. All right, so we want you to imagine what the world could look like in a truly inclusive environment where every student has opportunities to earn a high school diploma, which then leads them to have full and meaningful access across all of their community as they move into being adults and outside of the school system. And that's really what we're hoping for as we look at how the alternative pathway provides access for everyone to finally be able to achieve that dream. So we need to kind of ground ourselves a little bit in a couple of important concepts. And the first one is presuming competence. And what that really means is that we believe that without explicit evidence, like we have to have hard evidence that a student is not understanding, that we believe that they are learning. And we believe that all students, all children, and really all people can learn at high levels and engage in rich educational experiences, and that we're really responsible for providing that. Because an absence of providing them a rich educational experience means that they for sure will never have learned those things. So presuming competence is that belief that we should be teaching all students all the things that we believe students should be learning in school, and that everybody should have access to a high quality education. And then the second piece that we need to think about is supporting self-determination, really harnessing the idea that students, all students, should be driving their forward plans and visions and life, like what they expect in life, should be allowing students to help design that vision for themselves and teach them the ways that they can do that. So we're going to hear briefly from a young man named Otto. And Otto is going to share with us the importance of presumed competence, because I can talk about it all day long, but it is so much more powerful to hear from a student themselves sharing why this is such an important piece for their lives. I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And if Alyssa, you can tell me if my sound doesn't work, but I think I've got it set so it should.
Hello viewers, welcome to Where the Magic Happens. I'm Otto Lana, the winner of the graphic novella category for my acrostic Scrabble. You gotta hold it though. Start over. Hello viewers, welcome to Where the Magic Happens. I'm Otto Lana, the winner of the graphic novella category for my acrostic Scrabble poem, Freedom is Not a Game. This is my voiceover actor and brother, Addison. We are decade-delayed twins. Just look at this photo when he was my age. See the resemblance? I communicate in several ways, either through someone reading the words I have written in silence, or listening to Addison read my words to others, like right now, or my iPad and the voice through a computer-generated Australian man. My Australian man voice will read the description of my poem, and Addison will read the actual acrostic poem. Thanks to Jen, Lindsay, and all of the Kids Right judges. It's an honor to be a part of this program. Freedom is Not a Game by Otto Lana. Freedom. Fragility, responsibility, education, equality, democracy, opportunity, marginalized.
45 years ago, President Gerald Ford signed the law which allows me the freedom to receive an education as a disabled person. The fragility of this freedom is evident in that I have to prove my presence in this classroom is appropriate, year after year. I have to prove my placement and my academically rigorous curriculum is appropriate, year after year. I am threatened with a change in placement despite demonstrating academic success, year after year. With the emotional and financial toll this battle consumes year after year, we can definitely say, freedom isn't free. With freedom comes responsibility. We must make sure that freedom guarantees access to everyone. Democracy allows our freedom to vote and to exercise our opinions which shape our legislature and the laws that govern us. As we discover marginalized populations who are denied equal access and opportunities, we can right these wrongs with our collective voices to our elected officials. This acrostic poem on a Scrabble board is to evoke a sense of irony, because freedom is not a game. It is serious business. Thank you. Thank you.
So as you can see and hear from Otto, presuming competence is incredibly important in believing that all students can learn and that we need to provide opportunities. So that leads us into understanding why the alternative pathway is such a powerful tool for us to lean into that belief, to lean into that shared understanding that we need to provide every student access to curriculum that could lead to a diploma, because in absence of that, they won't have access to those educational opportunities. Well, we want to talk about a couple other things before I jump into the nuts and bolts of the alternative pathway. And the first thing is, when we looked across the state in our work, and we really dug into where are some of the barriers that exist for students having meaningful, inclusive opportunities, one of the things that was lifted was around mindset and people's understanding of why having students have accessible environments and school experiences, like why were they a problem? It really lives a lot in the systems and structures and mindsets that we have. And where we find those most readily available or apparent is really in the language that we use. And so before we even jump into the other pieces, we want to kind of have a brief little overview of some language and maybe some suggested shifts. So as you go about having conversations about diplomas and in IEP meetings, that these language shifts can actually shift the trajectory for students, and they're powerful and they're not huge. And so some of them might be something you kind of, that will stick with you, and others you're going to be like, oh, okay. So let's take a look at a few. So historically in education, words that are used to talk about students with disabilities are often ableist, or they use language that's othering, which is the idea that there's another, the other group. So there's the whole group and then there's the other group. And words like special education student or resource student, things like sped kiddo, sped student, things that are used kind of pretty prevalently, create an idea in our mind, this mindset that they are something other than a student. And that in and of itself creates barriers for students for having meaningful access to high quality education. And so we want to consider some shifts. And the first thing we should consider is, first and foremost, is the fact that a student has a disability always the most important part of the conversation that we're having? Do we sometimes default to talking about a student and saying special ed student rather than saying Joey? Right? Like sometimes it's used and it's as if it's important, but it's not when we really pull back and think about it. And so the first thing that we like to say is, if it's not important, don't use it in the context of that conversation. So they're a student, they're a learner, they're a scholar, or they're a student and use their name. If we need to talk about their disability because it does have context, then we can say a student with a disability or a student who's receiving supports and services. All of those things denote that first and foremost, everyone is a student, and then they have some additional things that they may need supports on. And that shifts the idea of who, where, and how the student is going to be receiving their education. So small shift, but actually pretty dynamic in helping us think about things a little bit differently. How do we talk about people and places that support disabilities? Well, sometimes we talk about them in words that are, so I was introduced as an education specialist to you. I served students in the classroom for 17 years. I served students with disabilities. And as a classroom teacher and as a co-teacher, I worked in a lot of different environments, but I was never a special education teacher. And why was I never a special education teacher? Because I would wonder, what does that mean? What does it mean to teach special education? And to me, if there's an English teacher and a math teacher and a history teacher, I know what they're teaching. But I'm not teaching special education because that's not something I would be teaching. I'm an education specialist, and the mindset there is a shift in the way that services are provided. And it starts to just change the dynamic and help us understand, like, what is our intention for students in classrooms. We also sometimes label classrooms in ways that are othering, and we'll say that's the special ed room, or that's the OT room, or that's the SDC classroom. That's othering in and of itself because we don't refer to any other classrooms in that way. And so we encourage the shift in mindset to, what is every other classroom called? Do we call them by their room numbers? Do we say Miss Coleman's classroom? How are they referred to? And making those shifts have powerful mindset shifts. It takes away the othering for a space and makes it inclusive in the whole school environment and gives responsibility for all students to everyone in the staff and in the school community. And then finally, the last thing, people spend a lot of time saying I want inclusion, or I want to go to an inclusion school. And what we're really wanting is to have inclusive practices be present. And those can look very different depending on the school site. And so we really encourage talking about things like accessible and universally designed schools, instruction, and classrooms, and inclusive and building for inclusivity and belonging, rather than inclusion as a verb, as something that's or a noun that's a thing. We want it to be the idea, the culture, and the community that it creates. So all that is to say, we want you to take a pause for a minute. And we want you to think about kind of those words, but also shift your thinking over to, what was it like in your own high school experience as you were getting close to graduating? Think about what it was that graduation meant for your family. And I want you to just pause for about 20 seconds and put yourself back in that time. What did it feel like? What kind of emotions were involved? Was it something that was expected and just like it was just going to happen? Was there excitement around it? Were you just tired and glad it was going to be over? What were the emotions that were involved in that? And just think about that for a minute. All right. No, it's not a lot of think time, but I want us to realize that for many families, and the families that we're talking about tonight, the students who are eligible for this particular pathway, for many of those families, those emotions that you felt as you were approaching your graduation are not things that were even an image in their mind about a possibility. And we're excited to be able to have this truly be something that we can say all students in the state of California have access to earning a high school diploma. And for every family, the dream of their child earning that diploma is a reality. And we're going to talk about how and who is eligible under this new pathway in just a minute. So some of what I'm going to show you in the next couple slides, I just want you to know is going to be a lot of visual, and I'm going to try and narrow it down. But sometimes finding law is hard on the internet. And so we wanted to provide you with kind of the whole thing, and then I'm going to give you the short explanation. All right. So California now has what we call the alternative pathway to a high school diploma. And this is specifically in the statute listed as for students with significant cognitive disabilities, but we like to refer to who is eligible as students who meet the eligibility to take the California Alternative Assessment. So with that, we'll kind of get into what that means and what that looks like in a minute, but just know that this is the population of students we're specifically talking about. Students who would be eligible to take the CAW, that alternative assessment. So this is just a summary of what this piece of statute, what this piece of law says. And I want to go over a couple of things. This is the actual education code up at the top, 512255.31 and 0.32. This 0.32 was the kind of the update. And what you can see where it's updated is that this part is kind of scratched out because it is now eligible for anyone who was in high school during this school year. So let me give you an overview of what it says. It says students with exceptional needs who were in high school in the 22-23 school year or later, attending a school district, county office of education, charter school, or state special school can graduate from high school through a newly defined diploma pathway by meeting the following criteria as referenced in the student's individualized education program. 1, this is the first piece of criteria. The student has been determined to be eligible to take the California Alternative Assessment. And 2, the student is required to complete state-aligned coursework, or state standard aligned coursework to meet the minimum state course requirements for graduation. I'm going to go into what each of those two things mean separately, but just know that that's the nuts and bolts. That's the general overview of who and what has to happen. So if you're wondering, and you're feeling like, oh, this is a lot of information that I'm going to be getting today, and I don't know I'm going to remember it. Hey, guess what? It's okay. You have access to these quick family guides. And there's also a version for districts that you have access to in the folder for these. And so if you find you need a refresher or you want to share with a friend, go with the family one. If you are a school employee or you want to share with a school employee, download the one that's for districts and give that to them. But it just gives you a broad strokes overview. It goes over what are the course requirements for the state, like a California state diploma. And then some of the frequently asked questions are here as well. So this is available for all of you. I just want to point it out to kind of reference you back to it. It just defines things a little bit easier. Let's take a look at what the state requirements are. Okay, so in the state of California, for graduation, there are things that California says, this is a minimum that we have to have in order to earn a diploma. These are those requirements right here. Now, if you're in any school district in the state of California, there are additional requirements that have been added to because the local school board can add additional requirements. But for the state of California, in order to get a diploma, at a minimum, you need 3 years of English, 2 years of math, including the algebra requirement, which can be met in algebra or integrated math 1 if you are a school that does integrated math. Science, 1 year of a life science, 1 year of a physical science, 3 years of social studies, which includes world history, US history, and then a semester of government and a semester of econ. And then 1 course in either a visual and performing arts, a world language, or a CTE, a career technical education course. These would be courses like some schools have culinary, some schools have automotive, some schools have engineering. That would fall into this course area. So 1 class in any of those 3, and then 2 years of PE. There's 13 courses required. That's the state's requirements. Now, there are lots of districts that have additional requirements. This allows for an exemption for students to only have to take these courses. But I want to be really clear. It does not mean that students only get to take this many courses. If they want to take additional courses, if they want to have, they want to be in choir for 4 years and they don't want 1 class, they want 4 or 6 or however long the student's going to be in that educational setting. It doesn't mean they only can take this many, but these are just the ones that are required in order to earn the diploma. Now, I also want to point out that this is not a new thing. This idea of a pathway exists for a lot of student groups. We have this same requirement allowing, or same pathway that allows students to only have to meet the state requirements if they are foster youth, members of military families, homeless youth, migrant families, so adjudicated youth. There are different pathways that have existed for a long time. Now this pathway is available for students that have the eligibility of, of taking the California Alternative Assessment, or the CAA. Sorry about that. So we have some questions that we want to provide for you to have the opportunity to think through, what would I ask my IEP team? I'm having a meeting and I want to understand, what are some of the things that I need to take into this meeting to be able to ask? And so we gave you some questions, and what you see on the screen right now are just some good questions to bring to those meetings to consider. The first one is the criteria says that students have to have access to state standards aligned curriculum. So that would be the first question I would ask. Does my child have access to the state standard grade level aligned curriculum in those course areas, in English and math and science and social studies, in visual and performing arts or CTE, in PE? All of those areas are things we need to be asking, how are they having access to those areas? The next question to ask would be, do our staff understand how to universally design so my child has the potential of having access to science in an actual science classroom and not necessarily taught by an education specialist, because that science teacher understands how to plan for the needs of all students? Be a great question to ask. The next question to consider is, when you're having the discussion about the least restrictive environment for your child, are we actually taking the time to consider that? Are we taking a moment to say, what would they need in order to be able to have their support needs met in general education first? And if they have more support needs than is available for them in that environment, then we could move to more restrictive environments, but starting first and foremost there. And then finally, do all of the students, or all of the families, all of you, understand that their child can earn a diploma on this pathway? That's a big question that we want schools to be pushing schools to start asking those questions. They should be letting families know that this is a pathway that is eligible for their student, and so we want them to be able to have access to them. I feel like I'm missing a slide in here, so I'm going to just take a pause for a second, because as part of the statute, one of the things that is not on here in my slides, but usually is, talks about what about the students' ability to continue until they're 22 years old. If they earn a diploma, does that stop them from being able to continue to receive education, services, and support through the school district? And on this pathway, the answer to that question is no, it doesn't end their services. They still continue to receive access to their educational services through the age of 22 or until they turn 22, just as it has been in the past. This is a really big step in allowing students to continue to receive their transition supports and all of the other things that we know are really beneficial to students having access to as they're continuing and learning and growing. So, big point, if a student earns a diploma on this pathway, they can still continue to receive services through 20 or until they turn 22 in the school district. Okay, so these are some talking points. We're trying to provide you with some talking points that are helpful to bring up as you're having these conversations. And we need to start considering this very, very early on. When we are talking about students and their, even in preschool, in early education, as we're having these conversations, how are we talking about communication? Because we know that communication is critically important to being able to know what students know. It's very difficult to be able to understand, is a student learning this? Is a student understanding this if they don't have access to meaningful communication? So as much as we're talking about this being high school, it's just as much an early education conversation to start building capacity for students to have that access early on. And another piece is we want to have students have access in meaningful ways to inclusive environments as early as possible. And there's a lot of research and data that shows that as students are excluded or served in separate settings in preschool, the potential for them having access to inclusive environments with their same age peers declines dramatically that early on. And we know that there's so much variety in what a preschool child is, what from one preschool child to the next, the difference in their communication and their behavior, it's vastly different for any preschooler. So we know that there is the ability to have children served early education in inclusive environments. And we really want to advocate as much as we can for that to happen so they continue to have access to their same age peers, high quality instruction with content specialists. Those are our general educators. And that starts early and then can continue with them. I'm just making sure I'm not missing anything here. So we also want to include our outside service providers, DDS and Department of Developmental Services, Department of Rehabilitation, and as often as possible, invite them into these conversations to help with thinking through planning for transition for students, but having those conversations early. Okay. These are some things, I'm not going to go through these. I just want you to know that they're available for those of you that are in the academic space and or for those of you that are going to go talk to your IEP teams and you would like them to kind of think about and consider some things within their systems. That's what this slide is really meant for. But I want to give it to you because my hope is that you're all going to go out and be incredible advocates. There are 77 people in this space right now. Imagine the power of 77 people going out and sharing what you have learned and sharing resources and asking good questions. There is power in that kind of a movement that we can actually see meaningful application and access for students on this pathway. So please share these, take a look at them, and then make sure that they're getting into the hands of people who can start answering these questions, really consider system change. So we want to hit a couple myths as we're, kind of getting closer to the end of this presentation. There are a lot of myths around what students with disabilities and people with disabilities need or don't need. And oftentimes there's this thought that students with extensive support needs don't really need a high school diploma to get a job, that they don't really need it because the certificate of completion is fine. But the truth is that 90% of employers prefer to hire young people with a diploma. And 66%, so 2/3 of employers on their application, one of the very first questions says, do you have a high school diploma? And if you cannot mark that box, you can't even apply for the position. And so it does have the potential for being harmful, because just because right now I don't have the skills to do a particular job doesn't mean I won't. And that's that presuming competence. And so we want everyone to have access to a diploma so they have access to apply for any job that they have the skills or want to work towards the skills to be able to do. And another myth is that most students with extensive or people with extensive support needs, they don't really need to worry about having a job or applying for jobs because they're just going to do volunteering or supported employment. And that could be true for some people, and that's perfectly wonderful for those that that is true for. But they all have a right to have meaningful employment and for an opportunity for that, for maybe volunteer or supported employment to turn into more long-term employment. And we don't want there to be a barrier of a diploma not being something that they were that they earned, when now there's no reason that every student, even our students, especially our students with extensive support needs, have access to this, because there is a pathway to get them there. So I'm going to show you briefly some things that you need to understand as you move into how do we get, like, how does this happen? So I'm sure some of you are wondering, like, okay, I know I need to talk to an IEP team because you keep saying that, but what am I supposed to talk about? Well, oh, this is the slide. It just got put in a funny place. This is that slide that answers the question, does it stop services? The answer is no. It's right here in the statute. They have until a student turns 22, just like in the past, in order to continue to receive their free and appropriate public education. Okay, this is, my slides are all in funny order right now. This is another document that I was talking about in the very beginning that will help you understand the different types of diplomas and answer some basic questions. This is kind of a good matrix to help see those things. So who is eligible for each of the diploma types? What are the requirements for them to be earning them? Can we use accommodations? Can we use modifications? It's a multi-page document. I know it's very small on the screen. It was just meant for me to point you in the direction and say, go look there. If you go to the slide deck, you can click right on this. You see my little hand icon. It is clickable and it will take you right to the full document that will be easier to read. Okay, so what happened to the certificate of completion? Nothing happened to it. It's still there. It's just, it's something that if a student gets to the end of their high school experience and they still have not been able to earn a high school diploma because they couldn't meet the requirements, it's still there. It's not gone away. We don't know if it will. That's still up in the air. But what we really want you to leave here tonight with is that every student's goal and every parent's goal and every school's goal should be that every student earns a high school diploma. That's our goal. That's what we're shooting for. We're going to plan and intentionally design that every student will have access to all of those requirements for a high school diploma, and they have until they're 22 to meet them. That's our goal. Our goal is meaningful access in the content that every other student has access to. So having access to high quality standards aligned curriculum, and that they're able to make their way through all of those courses. And if they need to earn a certificate, or if they need to be awarded a certificate of completion at the end because they couldn't meet those requirements, then that's a conversation to have at the end. But a diploma should be the goal for every student, because there is a way for every student to earn one. Okay, this is where I was thinking we were going. So the first thing we need to do is start having conversations with our school counselors and our IEP teams to create a course of study. And a course of study is something that has to be done for every student who is in high school. I have 3 high schoolers. They're currently doing their course of study with their counselors in the next 2 weeks. I just got an email. My son did his this morning. Typically, what happens is in the spring, the counselors will sit down and say, let's map out the 4 years of high school. And every year it might shift and get updated depending on what classes we passed or what classes we want to take. But we have a map to get us from what needs to be done till how much time we have left. So usually it might look like this first half. It may not be these extra years, but we know we have these extra years if we have a student that needs more time and they have until they're 22 to earn those credits. But we can map out where those 3 years of English are going to fall, where those years of math are going to fall, where they're going to take their science courses, where they're going to take their social studies courses. If they're going to have electives, they'll have lots of electives, because if they're receiving transition supports or if they're doing community-based instruction, all of those things would fall under elective credits. And then when are we going to do our 2 years of PE? Or we love PE, so we want to do it all the years. We design a course of study to reflect the course requirements that are needed, and we map out a plan. This needs to be happening. So if it hasn't been happening, or you have a high school student and you've never seen this, now is the time to talk about it. I saw some people have middle schoolers. As you are transitioning to high school, this should be the conversation that you start with at that transition meeting. Ask them if they have one. If they don't, bring this slide in and you guys can use it as a jumping off point. I don't have the slides visible right now in this presentation, but if you look at the slide deck, there are some, we call them hidden slides. They're just slides that have like an eye crossed through, and they show you some sample courses of study that could work for filling in for courses. I just don't have them because it was kind of a lot to look at. But know that those are available. So if you are feeling a little lost, or your IEP team is like, we don't know what to do, take a look at those extra slides as samples of what it could look like for a student to earn a high school diploma that has extensive support needs that can look like a lot of different things. Okay, so before we get to the Q&A, I'm going to hand it back to Alyssa. If you have questions, you can, I know some people are putting them in. Feel free to keep putting them in. We're going to hold answering them for a minute, and she's going to take back the charge. There you go.
Wonderful. Excuse me. Thank you, Stephanie, for that. That was filled with so much valuable information. We have so many questions. Kristen's been doing a great job in answering them both in the chat and in the Q&A. But for right now, I am placing in the chat both the English and the Spanish evaluations. If you could just click on them, as I said, 4 simple questions. And as Stephanie pointed out, yes, I am an NPR listener, and KQED and all the public television and radio, which we hope stays with us for a very long time. But yes, if you fill those out, it just helps us to keep bringing the likes of Stephanie back to the Connections California screen. So please just click on that, 4 easy questions. And perhaps we can get going on some of the ones. There is still a little bit of confusion, Stephanie, about being on the alternate pathway and being able to stay in a transition program after 18.
Great question. Okay. So this is looking different in different places. I'm going to say this wholeheartedly across any answer we give, is that sometimes it's a little bit more challenging to give a very direct answer because of the way that school districts choose to offer services and supports. But what we will say is this is still available for any student who was in high school in the 2022-2023 school year, or every year that's come since then. So any student who has entered high school since that school year, and anyone who was in high school. If they are in a transition program, they've already transitioned. Some people, like, they are no longer at the comprehensive high school, they've transitioned into a transition program. That doesn't exempt them from not being eligible for this. It would still be a question you need to talk to your IEP team about. And different transition programs that we've talked to are trying to figure out what that would look like, because as you know, if you have a child in a transition program, they're not on campus very much. They may be out in the community quite a bit of their day. And so it is changing the dynamic of what that program has been. And some are a little faster than others to figure out how to make that work. But there is intentional design around that, and it's important to ask those questions. I won't be able to necessarily answer them directly for you because it's going to be based on how they're approaching it within the school district. But they are still eligible so long as because they didn't graduate, right? They didn't earn a diploma at that point. So long as they met that eligibility of the timeline and they were eligible or are eligible to take the alternative assessment, then there is the potential to have those conversations about how they could still earn a high school diploma at this point. Did that sort of answer that? I know it was a roundabout, but do you think I got that one?
I think you did, and the takeaway is that different districts are handling this a little differently. So the important thing is to ask the questions, whether your students in high school, whether your students already in a transition program, it doesn't mean that it's not possible, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
And if you have more specific questions, I don't know that I can answer 74 people's emails, but if there's kind of a specific thing that's sort of a sticking point, just send me an email, and if I can try and answer it more specifically. I'm also seeing questions about algebra. I know I sort of fast-tracked that, but I want to answer it to the whole group. The algebra requirement is still a state requirement, but there is a waiver process for that. The other point to know is that there isn't specific language in the statute that says students have to meet any proficiency requirements. And so having access to standards aligned curriculum, having access to those algebra standards in the curriculum, they don't necessarily have to meet the proficiency of the algebra class. So they can be exempt through the waiver process, like the district can apply for a waiver still, it still exists. But they also could be in a class that is teaching those standards and giving them access to those standards to meet the requirement that way. So there's kind of duality to how that can look. And yes, any student who is in school or since 22-23 school year, all eligible so long as they meet the eligibility for the California alternative assessment. And I didn't talk about the requirement for that. It is part of an IEP team decision. It is part of a process that is used within districts, and there isn't necessarily a standard for that. There's some guidelines that they can use from the CDE website, but also many districts have adopted their own method for determining eligibility. So that is a question to ask in those meetings, but it does not mean the student has to take the CAW or has to take that assessment. They just have to be eligible to take that assessment.
Oh, that's a good distinction. Thank you. I just want to call everyone's attention to the evaluations again. Has anyone actually tried to click on them and they're not working? Because I don't have any responses yet. So if someone could be kind enough to click on them and see if they're working and give me some. I sent mine, I did mine. Okay. All right, they're coming in now. I think I'm just having some technical difficulties this evening. Thank you.
You're all wonderful. Thank you all for responding and for filling them out.
We really very much appreciate it. Okay, a couple of questions around what to do if the district has repeatedly told us they're still waiting for guidance from the state or county before offering this alternate pathway, and what do you suggest we do to advocate? And that's one of the reasons we're having this this event this evening.
That's exactly why we're having this event. So this is state statute. It is law. It went into effect in the 22-23 school year. And so it is something that students are eligible for, and districts really need to be moving on this. Part of why I gave you so many resources is to help encourage you to have those conversations and reach out to, if your district isn't necessarily moving on it, go ahead and reach out to your county office to ask them what the process is to see. And then it really is available. So there needs to be access, and it may be helpful to, when I was talking about, when I was showing you that course of study and I said there's a couple examples, look at those examples and maybe take those to your IEP meetings and say, whether you're ready for this or not, how are we going to plan for my child having access to standards aligned curriculum? Where is that going to happen? Do they have access currently in the classes they're in? So that's the first question. If my student was being served in a separate setting, with an education specialist as their teacher, I would say, what curriculum is being used? And is that curriculum standards aligned? That's the first question. If they can't necessarily answer that question, I would say, okay, well, I know that my child can receive instruction in standards aligned curriculum in English 1, because every other student is getting credit for that for a high school diploma in general education. And so if you don't have the means for them to have access in the setting they're in, how do we make that accessible for them? And so there are ways that we can provide suggestions and have conversations around, okay, well, let's think outside the box. It's not really outside the box. Let's think inside the box that exists already. Can we think about where curricula, where this access to these courses already exists, and how can my child have access to that? What supports do they need to be able to have access there? Great, let's do it. And then move into that direction. Sometimes it's just hard to get started, but we need parents to advocate, and we're working on our end to try and help districts as well. But I think that it's time to move. Like, that's the short answer, is it's time to move. And so please look at the slide deck and look at those sample courses of study to help give you some ideas of how to talk about it and what kinds of ways districts could support your child in lots of different settings.
Okay, thanks. We have several more questions and not all that much time left, but a couple of them are asking about modifications and accommodations and how they play into the alternate pathway.
A great question. So accommodations, not a problem. Anyone can have an accommodation. It doesn't change anything at all for anyone. So everybody can have accommodations. We believe in universal accommodations. But modifications get a little tricky. And I think that you've probably heard that, and that's why you're asking the question. Modifications in this case, on this particular pathway, students can have modifications to their curriculum. They can have modifications in the way that there are approaches for them to learn and to be able to communicate what they know. And it's not the expectation is that they will have access to standards aligned curriculum, which doesn't mean that they have to do the breadth and depth. When we think of like integrated math 2, like there's a lot of standards that are involved in that. There are a lot of really high level standard ideas. Students need to have access to the curriculum, but it may be a strand of that. So if we're talking about the concept in geometry, and the underlying standard for that happens to be about understanding shapes, and that's going to lead them to understand the complexities of the full IM2 standard, that's appropriate for them to be able to have access to that strand. We want it to be meaningful and we want it to be approachable, but it doesn't have to have proficiency at grade level standards. And that's the difference. So modifications are appropriate. It's not recommended, and nor should it ever be, that we just modify a student's grade. They didn't accomplish, we just gave them everything that everyone else had, threw them in a class, and then said, okay, they passed modified. Oh, that's not meaningful access. So let's get meaningful access by looking at what are the students' strengths, how can we tie those where they need some support to the grade level standards, but it may not be the full breadth and depth of that standard, and that's perfectly okay and still meets the eligibility for the standards aligned curriculum.
Okay, thanks. And still maybe time for a few more. A couple of folks are asking what the alternative assessment is like, and is there a limit of students who can take it?
Oh, great question. That is a really great question. So students that meet the eligibility under significant cognitive disabilities, it's a very small population of students, 1%. And so typically like between 1% and 2%. It should not exceed that. The state will be looking for making sure that all of a sudden we don't have this huge boom where everyone's now eligible to take the alternative assessment in order to be on this pathway. It really should be students that have continued to need that level of support and meet the eligibility requirements that have been in place before. When the state was trying to decide how do we identify this population of students that have extensive support needs, it's hard. It's not an easy cut and dry criteria, but we already had criteria for the alternative assessments, which is the same population of students we're talking about here. And so it is about 1% of students, of total student population, that would meet this eligibility. And so that's kind of the long and the short answer, 1 in every 100 students approximately. So it's not a large number of students, but they are students that have historically already been identified or will be identified for taking the alternative assessments when those state assessment times come around.
So I would think, and there were a couple of questions about this, if your student has an IEP but is on the diploma track already, they probably would not be eligible for an alternative pathway.
Not if they haven't already been eligible for the CAW and that hasn't been something, no. But they still have an opportunity for a diploma. That just needs to be the conversation. Again, that same conversation around, do they have access to standards aligned curriculum? How are they having meaningful access to that? What accommodations are in place? But if they're already a student that's in really middle school or high school and they haven't yet been identified as being eligible for the CAW, then likely they are not eligible for this pathway.
Oh, I like this question. Might be a good one to end on. It is 7:30 by the clock on the screen. When does this conversation for alt pathway begin? Can I bring it up in 4th or 5th grade?
Please bring it up in preschool. And if you're well, that's okay. Bring it up in 4th and 5th grade. It needs to be a conversation as early as possible because it's hard. Think about a child who has not had access to standards aligned curriculum. That's a lot of students that have not historically, we haven't followed a progression of English and math and science and social studies. If they get to high school and all of a sudden we throw all those classes at them that they don't have any basis of understanding, it's going to be really hard for them. And so we want to have these conversations early to make sure that that's happening at every single grade level across their entire education and that they're meaningfully able to they know what to expect. They have the basics. Maybe they haven't been able to show us what they've learned, but they understand a lot more than they would have if they never had any access or exposure. So it's never too early. It should be from the very beginning. And if you're in the middle of it, start having the conversation now too.
Okay, I think that could be a great place to stop. We try and start on time and end on time to be aware and mindful of everyone's time. So thank you so much, Stephanie, for that very informative presentation.